Okay, I think we're going to come back now from our break. I want to thank everyone who's stuck with us through the conference. And until today, I'm going to, in a moment, introduce our keynote speaker. But as I mentioned earlier, I also want to thank her for all of her assistance that she has given me in preparing for this conference. She's been a wealth of resources, provided a wealth of resources and contacts that have all been integrated at some point or another into this event. And so thank you so much for that, Doris. Let me get my screen on here. Okay, I'm going to, since it is a keynote, and I'm sure she'll be telling us a lot about who she is and what she does. I'll keep my intro somewhat limited. But Doris Maldonado is a foster mother who's also a bilingual health information specialist for families with special needs. She serves on numerous statewide boards and task forces that focus on disability issues. Among those, she has been co-chair for Keep the Promise Coalition, a NAMI bilingual trainer, founder of the Alpha Sigma Omega Latino Sorority, and she is a former chair of the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities. She describes herself as someone who wants to be a voice for others who have no choice. And so I want to thank you, Doris, for being with us today, and I want our audience to please welcome Doris Maldonado.
Gracias, James, and buenas tardes. Gracias for gathering here today. It's been another incredible series by and with Latinos with disabilities nationally and locally to engage in unnecessary and intentional national community conversations about solutions to our common challenges. I appreciate the space to share my lived experiences with the ABCs, as I deem them, the ABCs in DEI in the disability world. Although I am just a Latina mom born with disabilities, as I've been coined, it's a humbling honor to share my disability journey of navigating ableism's daily living, belonging, cultura, privilege, fragility, and societal indifference. I hope to provide not only anecdotal references, but also best practices de mi camino and becoming the navigator rather than the narrator. I received the invitation. It just so happens I received the invitation to join you all while I was at the emergency department, awaiting the pendulum swing, whether to have a cardioversion, which is electric shock to my heart, or a more invasive procedure. This and thoughts of my children granted me fuerza and compañía as I sit alone in a cold ED hallway, over capacity and very reminiscent of those during COVID. So thank you, James, again, and UCP for this opportunity. As we know, data findings in recent decades have finally acknowledged that Latine are significantly underrepresented in leadership roles, but more so within disability advocacy organizations, leading to a lack of focus on issues specific to our community. This absence is reflected in policymaking, misleading narratives, research priorities, and the allocation of resources. The disability rights movement in the United States has historically been led by white middle-class individuals, often excluding people of color from leadership and decision-making roles. This exclusion has led to a lack of understanding to address the unique needs of Latinos with disabilities when there should be nothing about us without us. Now, with DEI as the trending topic globally, these two movements should intersect, if not fuse together. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a novel idea. It's rooted within the federally mandated compliance of 1964's Civil Rights Act. It's become more and more inclusive of different groups over the years. Now, intersectionality is at the core of the modern DEI, shaping identities like gender, sexual inclusion and orientation, religion, ethnicity, race. But how have Latina been included, and how has disability been granted access in our barrios, granjas, y campos? The gap in representation and acknowledgement of Latina voices in the disability advocacy, setting the stage for discussing the issues and solutions, is at best the minimalist standard. The Constitution of the United States, which was created for the people and by the people, begins with we the people, nosotros. It does not have to be rewritten. It must be applied equitably. With almost 30% of US adults living with disabilities, translating to about 61 million people, 19.5 are children under the age of 18. For some of us, disability is congenital. For others, disability is acquired at some point throughout their life course. Some of us disclose our disability as part of our identity, others do not. And although many of us may experience functional limitations, this is not the case for all of us. So, before we dive into my ABCs of DEI and best practices in meaningful inclusion, a continuación, mi historia en navigating los sistemas. Entre ser y no ser, yo soy. I was born in el barrio of New York City of migrant parents from Borinquen, La Isla de Encanto. The West Side storyline definitely underscored the daunting experience of Puerto Ricans' flight into the Commonwealth territory democracy as second-class citizens in the US. My parents came to the land of opportunity from El Caribe to the mainland during the emergence of air travel, which led to the largest wave of Puerto Ricans to New York City, known as the Great Migration. Puerto Ricans were the first Hispanic group to move to the States in large numbers and face language access discrimination, education, housing, employment, gang violence, and medical inequities. After my brother was born, my parents attempted to become pregnant again, and after 15 years, I was conceived, making my arrival a geriatric miracle. 2 days after my birth, I was diagnosed with congenital defects that would affect my daily living with developmental and physical impairments indefinitely. I lived with limitations that required me to have a combination of lifelong special supports or for extended durations. My mother died during COVID alone, blaming herself for my disability hardships because of her insistence on having a daughter. Throughout my life, I've experienced and survived being a medical anomaly in urban, suburban, and rural settings from New York, Puerto Rico, California, and Connecticut. My diverse lived experiences in disability have not significantly changed, even in the best case scenarios and settings, whether it be health, education, career, housing, equal opportunity, and the basic human right in pursuit of felicidad. Like the only Latina Supreme Court justice and with a disability, Justice Sotomayor shared, in every position that I've been in, there have been naysayers who don't believe I'm qualified or who don't believe I can do the work. And I feel a special responsibility to prove them wrong. This is a Latine with disabilities credo. I've built a reputation as a trusted messenger with social capital in education, employment, income, civic engagement, and faith-based key areas of bonding, bridging, linking, and identifying systemic silos, resources, and unmasking misinformed narratives. As a civil servant, I'm a certified teacher, community health worker, guardian at Litem for children in placement, lead for Family Voices National Project on Language Access in Healthcare for families of children and youth with special healthcare needs, as well as their Family Engagement and Leadership in Systems of Care Advisory Committee. I've been the first Latina in many endeavors, and more so as a Latina with disabilities. I am the proud founder of National Alpha Sigma Omega Latina Sorority Incorporated, which we organize Latina scholarship and community empowerment. Faculty member of the American Association of Pediatrics, Yale University School of Medicine, empowering Latiné through community and belonging, as well as the National Children's Hospital Solutions Advisory for patient safety. I've been the first Latina with Disabilities National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI Connecticut president, first Latina chair, and government appointee of the Council on Developmental Disabilities, which was established half a century ago. The first Latina chair of the Keep the Promise Coalition, Crisis Standards of Care Advisory Council, National GOT Transitions Cultural Competency Advisory, the CDC, Homeland Security ESF 15, PCORI's Building Capacity to Improve ICU Communication Together, National Community Health Workers Association, National Patient and Family Advisory Network, the first Latina chair of the Accessibility and Inclusion Ministry for Unitarian Society of Hartford, the first Latina founding president of a special education parent-teacher association in Connecticut, co-lead for a statewide community of practice support for families of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, North Central lead ambassador for the Department of Developmental Services Cultural Competence Linguistics Charting the Life course, Department of Children and Families National Family First Initiative, statewide bilingual counselor, advocate, and court interpreter for survivors of domestic violence, and statewide support and interpreter for families regardless of income or immigrant status at planning and placement 504 meetings and probate courts. My service has afforded me the honor of receiving Connecticut's Top 50 Hispanic Leaders Award, Honor a la Mujer Hispana Award. I was featured in the Connecticut Historical Society. Not that I care for that one too much because I don't feel historic, but yet it's regarding the common struggle individual experience and exhibition about mental health and Mental Health America's Connecticut Let's Face It campaign. Most recently, my Reach Our Stories have expanded as the Connecticut Mirror News Project Community Editorial Board opinion contributor, along with my colleague Renee, who spoke previously, National Latina Oral History Project, and Voters Language Access Rights Educating of federally funded organizations' mandate and our community's entitlement to receive meaningful access for all voters in our preferred languages since 1964, as well as 1993's ADA's Disability Access and other federal orders. While this is not an exhaustive list in my endeavors, the greatest of all of my accomplishments and blessings continue to call mommy or mama. With double digits of children in foster care and medically complex, I've nurtured and protected each one under my care. This after being told by providers that I would never, should never have the privilege of being a parent, a mother, and that it was probably for the best. It is out of humble appreciation for many of these opportunities in eye-opening civic engagement that I've labored over Latina diversity in the disability movement. My children and legacy deserve a chance and opportunity. But being the first Latina with disabilities in historically white spaces has come at an exhaustive cost, both personally and physically. We know that 1 in 4 persons has a disability, 1 in 6 have a developmental disability, and 1 in 6 persons with disabilities is Latine. When Latinos are the largest minority in the US, everyone here is directly connected to and with a Latine with disabilities. However, the significant demographic presence is not reflected in the leadership or representation within the disability justice movement. ¿Por qué? Over 36 million of us are eligible to vote. So are we merely checking off intersectionality boxes all the way to the exit door once we've satisfied data sets, or forfeiting our collective Latina power? While appearing to address intersectionality in data, we remain walled and waiting for the implementation of and participation in meaningful change. The superficial approach leaves many of us feeling tokenized rather than truly included. Granted, although some voices with marginalized backgrounds are heard, we are frequently only included to fulfill a diversity quota, not to genuinely address our needs and perspectives. My lived experiences with the ABCs of diversity, equity, inclusion as a first-gen disabled Latina have not met the common access experiences that my fellow non-Latina with disabilities have. Mi abecedario begins with ableism, belonging, y cultura in DEI. The disability community is incredibly diverse, encompassing a vast range of experiences and identities. Yet, despite our diversity, many remain silenced and many experiences undervalued. Ableism manifests uniquely within the Latina community, both from the outside and within, as a lack of understanding or acknowledgement of our diversity, relegating us to the periphery and further marginalized. Latina communities and individuals with disabilities often face double discrimination: first, as members of a marginalized ethnic group, and second, as individuals with disabilities. Mainstream disability movements often overlook the specific challenges faced by Latina communities, such as language barriers and cultural stigmas surrounding the disability. Not only do healthcare settings face pervasive negative biases and inaccurate assumptions about our quality of life, capacity to communicate and make decisions about our likelihood of survival and value, it's the cornerstone of systemic indifference. Nationally, there are state crisis standards of care advisory councils deciding standards of 1 to 5 years of viability and care that disabled and medically complex patients are afforded, according to the person making the call. Oftentimes, there is not even a peer with lived experiences to advocate and educate on why our lives and our participation matters. Our families struggle daily with anticipatory grief, despite the overlap in both prevalence and similar inequities experienced by Latine and disabled, because little research has examined the health and healthcare outcomes at the intersection of our community and people with disabilities. Given the prevalence of discrimination, I can attest that the racism we experience is compounded by the ableism experienced by people with disabilities, amplifying disparities in the participation of our own socioeconomic determinants. Research indicates that our communities with disabilities are multiply marginalized and face disparities when it comes to the quality of life, but less is known about the direct impact that ableism can have on our quality of life. Current approaches to measuring Latina disability do not sufficiently capture the complexity of our disabled populations, which has had serious, very serious consequences. Inaccurate and insufficient measures remain to have a profound impact on the evaluation and allocation of underserved, diverse disability-related programming and resources. The term false narratives, politically coined now, referencing our communities, has been slammed like a ball at a handball tournament and ricocheting at our expense. Narratives are subjective, and tell of the orator's story. The navigator actually steers their lived experiences with the whole truth and nothing but the truth in an upstream attempt to navigate equity in disability diversity. We are more likely to delay care or forego civic engagement more than our peers with disabilities. We do not see ourselves in our providers. We are not granted access to information in our preferred language. We are not invited to and valued at the table. Like outsiders, todo sobre nosotros, sin nosotros. So somos o no somos. David Savarese is a gifted young writer and national Latina advocate for non-speaking people with autism, making it so. In his documentary Deej, we learned that he was once identified as a profoundly disabled foster child that was adopted by his parents, and they struggled to ensure his inclusion in the local public school system, eventually winning the right for Deej to receive education in public schools. His parents framed their challenges as a civil rights struggle against ableism. DJ went on to become a college student that advocated for his peers, those who are dismissed as incompetent because they are neurologically diverse and facing Latine cultural barriers. Ableism is a threat to our democracy, our human rights, health, and overall quality of life. Quality of life measures have reinforced examining the burden of our disability and ethnicity while simultaneously praising our resilience, ignoring our fatigue. Belonging in betrayal. Belonging has been coined as a grandiose namaste, a euphoric feeling of completion. The need to belong is based on a motivational human need to maintain interpersonal relationships and positive social bonds, so much so that it becomes significant for overall development and well-being. The need to belong is so potent that some people paradoxically prefer to be in a group of strangers than to be alone. I have to ask, does this mean that we never belonged? I've never belonged. Despite the compelling and appealing algorithms, I've pledged allegiance to the flag since I could recite it and teach it to my children and students, and when I voted. Was that all under false pretense? Have I been lied to? The welcome signs didn't grant me passage to belonging, or was it I lost it in translation? Alexa, pause. My apologies. I'm sure, Alexa, stop. AI. I'm sure, like many, I had to recite 1787's Constitution's preambles, basic principles throughout elementary school, all the way to high school, honors social studies. How many of us are able to recollect it, and how quickly and in your preferred language? It begins with we the people. Nosotros, el pueblo de los Estados Unidos, con el fin de formar una unión más perfecta, establecer la justicia, asegurar la tranquilidad interna, proveer a la defensa común, promover el bienestar general y asegurar las bendiciones de la libertad para nosotros y nuestra posteridad. Ordenamos y establecemos esta Constitución para los Estados Unidos de América. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That was written 236 years ago. Yet, we remain in wait to have the belonging welcome wagon shout out our social media handles. In my house, my star-spangled banners wave together the American and the Borinquen's flag, along with others that adorn the foundation. The burden of betrayal in belonging. There are cultural nuances that affect how disability is perceived within our Latina community. Often, there is a lack of understanding or acceptance of disability due to cultural stigmas or misconceptions. The concept of belonging and how we as individuals with disabilities feel betrayed by both our own community and the broader disability rights movement leaves us burdened and with neither space fully embracing our identities. Cultural betrayal trauma occurs when comunidades that are supposed to offer support and understanding instead marginalize us and are then excluded from critical conversations and opportunities for support. This betrayal is not solely a personal burden, but a systemic issue that undermines the effectiveness of our collective cultural efforts. Earlier, I shared DJ's documentary and prognosis as a profoundly disabled foster child who triumphed as a national leader. But I want to talk about Bruno. Most of us have heard Disney's Encanto, the Enchanted movie, and the catchy sing-along song titled We Don't Talk About Bruno. The song introduces the audience to Bruno, a prophetic phenomenon of the Madrigal family. His differences, in comparison to the rest of the supernatural generational members, are enough to subtly warn children to, quote, live in fear of Bruno's stuttering or stumbling. And the song ends with his young relative who's questioning her own belonging to conclude, I never should have asked about Bruno. Beyond the microaggressions, we learn that there are things and people we should not speak of, even ones cast out to live closeted or worse, in seclusion behind a wall. Because behind that wall, away from the divergent, we remain out of sight, out of mind, where we do belong. Becoming rather than belonging was instilled in me as one of the first costumbres y anhelos taught by my parents, with reservation and caution. To become means to grow, to change, and to transform. Former Lady Michelle Obama shared that becoming isn't about arriving somewhere or achieving a certain aim. I see it instead as moving forward, a means of evolving a way to reach continuously towards a better self. The journey doesn't end. Our disability journey doesn't end. It ebbs and it flows. Our Latinidad journey doesn't end. It's the alpha and the omega, the beginning and a fin. Becoming isn't a need to belong and fit in. It's an infinite cycle of growth, change, transformation, and making it so. Despite our history and legacy, the journey of Puerto Ricanos is not commonly known or understood. As a Latina, deeply rooted in Borinquen, it's a civic duty to share with you before sharing a story of a leader who became the American dream. Puerto Rico has been a U.S. territory for over 125 years since 1898, and our people have been U.S. citizens for 106 years since 1917. However, residents are kept from voting in U.S. presidential elections and have no representation in the Senate, with only limited representation in the House of Representatives. El Man Badillo was a Bronx, New York politician and the first person born in Puerto Rico to become a U.S. congressman. Badillo faced exclusion from disability discussions despite his contributions to civil rights and representation as the original immigrant. He emphasized that while many share their parents and grandparents coming here and couldn't speak English stories, that they were poor, for him, it wasn't his parents nor his grandparents, it was him. You see, we don't benefit from the luxury of falling forward. As Latina with disabilities, it's courage over complacency. Becoming a solutions-based community with disabilities rather than be problem-focused has empowered and fueled resolve to drive positive change. Complexity catalyzes cultura y comunidad. Of course, there are cultural nuances that affect how disability is perceived within our communities. Often, there is a lack of understanding or acceptance of disability due to cultural stigmas or misconceptions. Complexity and continuum are necessary in our community's culture while connecting the past with the future. Yes, we've historically faced systemic indifference excused by a broken system. But when was it anything other than what it was intended for? Systems aren't meant to be forever after. They're a set of principles or procedures meant for moving forwards. It's a method, not an answer to the infinite human condition. Equity challenges us to become the navigators rather than the narrators, regardless of complexity and el que dirán. Our lived experiences have taught us that the two are necessary for linking to the past to the future, so that we are not doomed to repeat it, although we have. Now, cultura weaves familismo with the importance of close family ties and collective family responsibility. This plays a crucial role in how our disability is perceived and managed. Family members often become primary caregivers, which can be a source of support, stress, and isolation, as our families often feel reluctant to seek outside help due to stigma or fear of discrimination. The lack of Spanish and Portuguese-speaking providers and accessible information make it difficult for Latinos with disabilities to navigate socioeconomic systems. With 10 dialects in Spanish and our Brazilian Latine whose preferred language is Portuguese, language barriers also hinder effective communication leading to misunderstandings and mismanagement between life-threatening and life-saving decision-making and participation. There are 10 principles of disability justice according to SIN's Invalid, a disability justice-based performance project led by disabled people of color. It starts with intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement solidarity, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, collective liberation. What does all of this mean for the largest national minority group of Latinos with disabilities to change the lack of diversity in the disability movement and make it so? How do we become all that we are meant to be? I'll share best practices from my libreta sagrada to address the lack of Latina diversity in disability advocacy and solutions-based best practices. Here's a structure that frames the key issues and solutions while engaging our audience with real-world examples and actionable strategies. Again, these are my best practices and my lived experiences. Genuine inclusion. Teach one and reach many. Bienvenidos, comadres, compadres, madrinas, padrinos. We must move beyond tokenism and work towards genuine inclusion. This means creating spaces where diverse voices are not only heard, but actively sought out and integrated into decision-making processes. Despite the significance of our challenges, there is limited research focused on the intersection of race and disability, particularly within our own Latina community. Most studies focus on either race or disability, but not the compounded effects of both, leaving a gap in understanding and addressing our unique needs as Latine with disabilities. Voting rights and civic engagement. Expand the access. Ensure polling places are accessible to Latine with disabilities, offering curbside voting, absentee ballots, and accessible voting machines. Language assistance. Provide plain language, bilingual ballots, and voting materials in Spanish and Portuguese to eliminate language barriers. It's the law. Voter outreach. Launch voter education campaigns focused on Latina with disabilities to increase awareness and participation in local, state, and national elections. Policymaking processes often overlook the needs of Latina with disabilities, focusing instead on broader, more generalized disability issues. This invisibility in policy discussions have led to gaps in services and supports. Engage, please engage and educate your elected legislators to provide meaningful information and access on your individualized disability journey. There are court coaches and mentors among us and organizations available to help. Do you know who your legislative leaders are and champions are? More so, do they know you? Mine do, whether it be detrimental or instrumental. But it's our civic right and responsibility. September 17th is National Voters Registration Day. So go out, bring a compañera o compañero, register, and celebrate your civic freedom with un brindis de cafecito. Access to services. We often face systemic racism within disability services, such as vocational rehabilitation, special education, and social services. These services are underfunded in communities of color or are culturally insensitive, further marginalizing us. Research those that are federally funded agencies because they are all mandated by 1964 Civil Rights Act to engage and provide accessible information in meaningful ways. They have federal grant funds, and please ask how your community is included and how you may participate. Community and family support play crucial roles in our lives. However, the reliance on family caregiving often results in isolation from the broader social networks and limits opportunities for independence and self-advocacy. There is an urgent need for community-based solutions that are culturally sensitive and led by Latina individuals. This includes community education programs that are designed and delivered by Latina advocates who understand the cultural context. Community health workers, promotores, guardian ad litem, social workers, faith-based organizations, councils, policymakers, disability rights organizations, the National Medical Legal Partnership, UCP, and many others may have resources and information available to provide us with individualized, meaningful access in our preferred languages. Family Voices National has a family-to-family center, which is in federal statute and federally funded in each and every state and territory, serving families of children with disabilities from prenatal to young adulthood, regardless of income and citizenship status. Blending cultural values with disability rights education opportunities for caregivers, by caregivers, and self-advocates should be the standard and not the exception. Financial accessibility. Address, advocate, and educate about the financial barriers faced by those of us who are receiving public assistance, SSI, or SSDI, ensuring that the economic constraints and federal restrictions do not exclude us from participating in critical conversations, care, and activities, which is so essential for true inclusivity. Social determinants of health like income, education, and access to social services have a profound impact on our quality of life. Many of us live in low-income households where financial constraints limit our access to healthcare, healthy food, transportation, safe housing, and participation. Financial literacy is essential for self-sufficiency. Personal financial management, budgeting, and savings as early as elementary school should be a graduation pay it forward nationally for our youth. Continuous education, ongoing education about intersections of disability, race, and socioeconomic status is crucial. Education should be aimed at dismantling biases and promoting a deeper understanding of diverse experiences and peer support. Transition programs, we were just talking about transition programs. Policymakers and leaders must resist from making educational and adult healthcare transitions separate and unequal. Until high school graduation, specialists are supposed to provide wraparound services through home and community-based services care and IDEA protective services. During our most valuable time, we're expected to figure it all out without peer support and without a roadmap to chart our life course. It's a dim light at the end of the tunnel for youth. We must establish and promote programs that help Latina students with disabilities transition from high school to college, high school to trade school, and high school to work, focusing on academic support, self-advocacy, access to accommodations, and healthcare. Invest in our future by investing in theirs. Leadership and advocacy, mentorship, empowerment. Creating mentorship programs for Latina with disabilities will help build leadership skills and empower individuals to take on advocacy roles. Representation in media, in politics, and community organizations also help shift the public perceptions and reduce the stigma. Civic participation, get involved. Encouraging Latine with disabilities to become involved in civic engagement and advocacy can help drive change at the local, state, and national levels. Please encourage intersectional advocacy that recognizes the dual identities of Latina individuals with disabilities by forming coalitions that include our disability voices in broader DEI conversations. Showcase the collaboration between the disability rights education and Latina-led organizations, which work together to ensure that disability rights are understood and supported within the context of our cultura. Legal advocacy. Collaborate with legal organizations to ensure voting rights for Latine with disabilities, that they are protected under the ADA voting rights, Title VI, and others. Know and live your rights freely and frequently. Educating providers and the public. Awareness campaigns. We need to launch awareness campaigns that highlight the challenges faced by the Latinas with disabilities, and that will help educate the public and reduce stigma. These campaigns should focus on issues like ableism, racism, and the importance of cultural competence in service provision. Training programs. Developing and implementing training programs for providers, educators, and employers on the intersection of race and disability will improve outcomes. Teach one, reach many. These programs should emphasize the importance of communication while listening to and valuing the lived experiences of individuals from diverse backgrounds with disabilities. Building inclusive communities. Cultural competencies trainings. Providing cultural competency trainings for healthcare providers will improve the quality of care and services when it includes our lived experiences and participation. Community-led initiatives, encouraging community-led initiatives that focus on our specific needs. These initiatives should include peer support groups, community education programs, and advocacy. Engage the media and public awareness, representation in the media. Advocate for more accurate and positive representation of who we are with disabilities in the media, challenging the stereotypes and highlighting our contributions to society. Public education campaigns. Launch public education campaigns that address the intersection of race, disability, and culture, raising an awareness and promoting inclusion at all levels of society because it's the law. Include and promote access for youth. Our Latina youth become adults. And if we are not successful early on, they are going to need a place to be supported. If they are not reflected in a diverse disability community where Latinos fully gain access and equity, if they are not supported by healthy adults and communities, they become adults in crisis and in debt. This is a call for action for advocates, policymakers, and community leaders to prioritize Latina representation in disability advocacy and to adopt the best practices that I've shared. The lack of diversity in disability world is not merely an oversight, it is a systemic issue that requires concerted effort to address. Marginalized disability communities are as experts in our own care and in decision making, yet our intersectionalities are dismissed as detriment. Introspection and insight are rarely gained by our allies unless they too voice from lived experiences and intentional empathy. Social determinants and politics are not a one and done, and they shouldn't remain a palpable dread about our future. By acknowledging ableism, betrayal, and complexity, moving beyond checkbox diversity, and valuing the insights of our individual unique experiences when showing up as experts with lived experiences, we will ensure Latina disability victory. I am my parents' wildest dreams, just like my children have been a dream I was told could never happen. I will leave with this with Justin Dart Jr., a leader of the international disability rights movement and a renowned human rights activist, widely recognized as the father of the American with Disabilities Act and the godfather of disability rights movement, who called for solidarity among all who love justice, all who love life, to create a revolution that will empower every single human being to govern his or her life, to govern the society, and to be fully productive of life quality for self and for all. Gracias y H.
Thank you so much, Doris. Thank you very, very much. I want to go right to some questions. A lot of really just, well, I mean, I love your list in terms of your recommendations, all extremely useful. And I should ask if so I don't forget, if someone wants to see a copy of your speech, if that might be shared as well later, in case they weren't able to take notes. I want to just go back right away to me, kind of a core question that I think ties right to the theme of your presentation. And it's about DEI, right? Diversity, education, equity and inclusion. And of course, in recent years, I know some organizations, including UCP, have started to tag on an A at the end of that in terms of access, right? But just to that question, you know, to be blunt, you know, we're in a time where the idea, the concept is under attack. And there are people who just think it's frivolous, counterproductive, you name it. The insults have been sort of leveled at the idea of DEI. And at the same time, we've come farther than we've ever come. I mean, you mentioned, of course, in your presentation, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which is in many ways sort of the impetus and the spur for the movement itself that has matured over the decades. Your assessment as someone who lives it and breathes it every day, how do we survive the attack on the ideas of DEI and accessibility? Because I think they are under assault.
They definitely are under assault, and they remain siloed from my experience. Unfortunately, in the DEI movement, and in when I've been a part of DEI movements locally and nationally, it has not been intentionally inviting, welcoming, belonging, inclusive of the disability community. So the access, that scarlet letter that many of us with disabilities bear witness to on a daily basis, we have not been included in that. That seems like a bigger, monster to undergo, as was the civil rights, because language access and everything else trickled in afterwards. We are not included, and it's more so we're not included if we have indivisible disabilities, if we have mental health disabilities. Mental health disability advocates and leaders don't want to be identified with developmental disabilities or physical disabilities, and vice versa. So there is this call for a need for us to come together and reignite and reunify our efforts, because we are working in silos. We do say that we're working together, and it's power for the people, and unidos somos, but we're not. And that's what I found nationally and locally. And unfortunately, I experienced this firsthand. I was really floored last year when I attended as the chair of the Council on Developmental Disabilities, I attended our National Association of Councils for Developmental Disabilities, and I spoke with their CEO, their ED. I was introduced to her by our director, and I was so excited to meet with her and to ask her about inclusion and actually access. I saw in person that there were many people there that whose preferred language was not English. So there were no translators, interpreters. There was no translations, and they had even issues with ASL or sign language interpreters. They didn't even have that. So we were in the wonderful world of Disney in Florida last year, and I saw all those inequities, and I'm thinking, wow, this is a national organization. You're receiving federal funding. You're supposed to be the lead for all of us. And in my tiny state of Connecticut, what are you doing? So I asked her, I said, I'd really like to discuss with you DEI and IDEA and the access to language and the information, because the information isn't even in plain language, which came about after the language access in 1964. It came about in 2010, the plain language executive order. And what she told me was DEI is not IDEA. And I said, I couldn't agree with you more, because language access came about almost 60 years ago, way before IDEA and ADA. So they are not one and the same, but you do have people here and leaders here, councils from other states around the nation and in the territories that can't gain access. And what was done by that organization, which they've corrected since, the translators, the translation, and the interpreters had to be paid by. We had Edgar here, one of the panelists on the first day. He's a member of the council in Idaho. His council had to pay $3,000 for an interpreter the year before that, and they were supposed to correct it last year, and they still. And what their response also, because I gathered them all, and I said, you're in violation of this. This is an entitlement. This is not because, oh, they're Spanish speaking and we need to give them a handout. No, this is an entitlement. So how is it that you're being inclusive, and where did you go wrong? Why are they not being given access to the information? And they told me, well, they never filled out the survey that was sent out, and they never told us that they needed a translation or interpretation or ASL.
Yeah.
These leaders had already been there the year before. They brought a complaint the year before. What makes you think that, oh my goodness, now I'm no longer disabled? I don't need the services.
Yeah,
So,
I think so. I hear what you're saying about silos, right? I mean, and this is so this, the conversation broadly, even beyond the Latino community or communities of color, on some level, when it comes to inclusivism for people with disabilities, that's as much a silo question as anything, right? The idea
yes.
that ableism or for other reasons
Yes.
things operate in a way that does not even consider the accessibility for people with disabilities. And of course,
and that's that betrayal that I was mentioning, because even among our own, we're othered. If you have an invisible disability, I get that all the time, and my children do. Oh, you're not disabled, you're just faking it. Okay. And so we're not included.
Yeah, and the but do you, going back to my original question, do you still see progress being made and silos, for instance, or achieving more solidarity? Because it does occur to me, and there was something you said earlier in your presentation about democracy, and the idea that inclusion is really democracy as well, right? And even at its core, I think we've heard a lot of conversations recently about democracy and the threats to it. At its core, democracy is also about fairness, right? It's how we treat each other, and do we treat each other in a fair way? And if we're not doing that, then we're probably intrinsically being undemocratic. But do you see still the advances being made despite, again, some of the backlash against things like inclusion, ideas like DEI?
In my insistence, I have seen changes and attempts made. We have allies. I joined for some time the Municipal Language Access Network, which is they went from maybe 50 to 100 governmental and quasi-governmental agency representatives to address the 1964 Civil Rights and Title VI together, because their government wasn't fully supporting or engaging in compliance. So I have seen, and now they've come up to maybe 500 nationally that participate in this group, but it's very exclusive. So you have to be part of a government agency or quasi-government agency. They get together and they discuss best practices, because across the board, when I'm hearing, even from my Secretary of State, when I addressed her regarding the voting and the awful translation in Spanish that was done last year, an outside agency that was contracted, it wasn't even legible for our Spanish speakers. So what I'm hearing across the board is that there's no funding. And
Okay.
that's false, because since 2021 in the Biden administration, they passed executive order 14 something. I don't have the exact order, but they passed with the ACA an executive order that put in place accessibility and access to funding by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So there is funding out there. It's a matter of making it happen. And there are two organizations, two Office of Language Access organizations that are only, Hawaii was the first in 2007, and New York has been the second in 2023. There are no other Office of Language departments nationally or in the territories. They do it at a municipal level. They try to do their best. They try to get the trainers in. We have translators that have to be certified in medical translation, interpretation, in judicial, legislative, legal translation, and educational. So those are three different realms, and I've participated in all three. And it's a free for all with the best of intentions. But what happens is that most of our people are denied that access, and they don't even know it. I mentioned yesterday in our survey with Family Voices, about 80% of our United States communities do know that they have a right to information in their preferred language, but they don't access it, or it's not made accessible to them. And then there's the ay bendito and the stigma and being identified as a person that doesn't speak the language. And my state of Connecticut, most of us don't have English as our state language. The Constitution does not have as an official language. So what are we doing here?
Yeah.
We need
Let
to
me
educate our legislators.
switch gears just a tad. Throughout your presentation, also describing not just the silos, different forms of discrimination, exclusion, etc., and the barriers that exist. One of the things you didn't mention, and maybe because it's extremely obvious, is the gender question. And I wonder, as you think about and you approach these issues, obviously you've had to deal with that as well. How do you meld that into sort of your daily work that you do? A lot of it, obviously, is advocacy work and advocating.
the gender issues, and now we're speaking of multi-gender identification. So I use Latine as all inclusive, Latino, Latina as I was taught, or Hispanic as I was taught. As far as the gender issue is concerned, it's still an issue. Because in many of the nonprofit organizations, in many of the advocacy organizations, you see primarily, and educators, you see primarily women, and not women of color, not sufficient amount of people of color in general. You see that, and then at the top you'll see the male figures, but they're mostly as someone in my past life and work would say, he was just an old white guy, so he would just walk into a room and everyone was on him and listened to him, and everyone else, phased out in the background. There are gender roles and gender issues, but I think we're moving in the right direction. The LGBTQ community has done a phenomenal job with our allies and making sure that we are where we need to be, for the most part, and we can be. So that's been another movement within the Latina and within the disability movement. We're just trying to come together, but we still remain in silos, and that's an issue.
Yeah.
I try to bring in my own when I have a role and position and space. I intentionally try to bring in one of my own, so that that's not an excuse, but it's definitely a handing of the torch, to say, and a mentoring opportunity.
Yeah,
for,
yeah.
for all.
What I'm kind of hearing throughout your conversation so much is about a kind of a convergence on some level of so many different tracks, at least over the last several decades. And again, we're speaking in the context of a pushback right now, but a
Yes.
convergence of movements by the LGBTQ community, movements in terms of women's rights, even obviously disability rights,
Right.
communities of color, and those have been on some level progressing simultaneously for several decades. And I had sort of interpreted the conversations in recent years about intersectionality as a kind of that convergence, right? The idea that people started to see that even if you're in one of those categories, you should also be fully aware of how it intersects with the other categories, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And
I
the
want
socioeconomic determinants of health, which also
yeah,
provides
yeah,
that foundation. But it's unfortunately what I've seen is that it's not it's not frequently adhered to, or it's not the go-to, because it's not a good space and a good feeling to have to be like myself, having to be the first among many, and trying to pull, because there's still that stigma, there's still that concern. Oh, government, big brother, or how much of a say are we really going to have? There's still that misunderstanding and misinformed narrative, and the false narratives that are brewing among our communities, especially during COVID. I think it got worse. We were getting better, and it got worse during COVID, when we were ousted from so many opportunities to get either vaccinated or having more information in our preferred languages. In my state, we were next in line to receive the COVID shots for people with disabilities. And the governors decided that Friday before the Monday, where we could finally get that first shot for those of us who wanted to. He finally said he decided, oh no, we're gonna go back to getting the vaccines for the elderly. They had already had a slew of days and weeks, and he just executive order, people with disabilities have to go to the back of the line again.
yeah. That was a really difficult time for people with disabilities, particularly those folks who were just obviously vulnerable, right? And you mentioned
Yes.
your crisis standards of care, which is something that UCP addressed as an organization at the time. I would love to close with some personal thoughts from you because it's a constant theme in your conversations, is your parenting. I mean, your children, children with disabilities, and you're a parent with disabilities, and you've merged all of these experiences. If you could close with what is for you kind of the message that you deliver to your children, a couple of who are more adults and a couple who are very young. What's that message that you deliver to them? Maybe some closing thoughts on that as we go out.
Just basically what my parents ingrained in me, that this is the land of opportunity and we make it happen. We make it so it's not the gender divide that I grew up in. It's having a voice and sharing that voice. So what I do with my children at the first PPT, IEP, at the first parent teacher meeting, they are speaking. They are there. Since kindergarten, they have been there, even birth to 3. I've had pushback from administration and DCF and social services saying, "Oh, it's too young. There's just too soon." No, it's not. They need to be there because it's about them. So there's nothing about us without us. And I've ingrained it in my children, and they see me. They reflect me like I reflect them. So I'm not the person that, do as I say, not as I do. I actually bring them with me because they are my source of not only inspiration, but they're my life. And if I don't do this with them, if I am not in their lives, what will come of them? That's my concern. That's my responsibility. That's my civic responsibility to my sons and the community, my children, and the community that I will leave behind, and that they will be thriving and leading in, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, that's a great lesson for any parent, of course. And I hear 2 words come to mind as I hear you talking about that. Example, providing an example, but also including, right? Including
Yes.
your children in living that example. So thank you so much, Doris Maldonado. I really appreciate your comments, your thoughts. Thank you for all your assistance and support throughout the preparation of this conference even. And I'm going to hand it over now for some closing thoughts from Armando Contreras, the CEO and President of United Cerebral Palsy.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, Doris. Thank you so much for being part of the 2024 UCP Latinos with Disabilities Conference. We really appreciate your participation, your insights, experience, and testimonies. So thank you very, very much for that. I just want to give some thank yous, but I hope that you found the UCP 2024 conference both insightful and inspiring. First, I want to thank James for guiding us through the UCP conference. James, your leadership, enthusiasm are truly appreciated. I know this is your 3rd conference that you've been helping us with. I'm also really grateful to Michael Lugardo and Alexis Sanchez, who have been working behind the scenes on the Zoom platform to make everything run smoothly. So thank you, Michael and Alexis. We're deeply grateful at UCP to our panelists, to our speakers, for sharing their invaluable insights and expertise. And of course, we extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Waymo, Ancor, and Source America, whose generous support was instrumental in making this event possible. So this year's conference has concluded. Please note that recordings of all sessions will soon be available on social media channels, so look out for that. And we look forward to your participation in the 2025 UCP Conference on Latinos with Disabilities. So thank you once again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.